Hello, everyone. My name is Cat Oriel with Forbes Breaking News. Today, I'm here with attorney Mark Sedlander. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So today we're here to discuss President Biden's son, Hunter. And he today he changed his plea in a federal tax evasion case to avoid a trial. He initially pleaded not guilty in January. So can you give us a little bit of a recap of the charges against him and why the sudden switch?
Well, he's accused basically of making false statements in connection with his taxes and not paying taxes. Why the switch? Well, every person who's accused of committing a crime has the right either to make the government meet its burden of proof and prove their guilt beyond a reasonable doubt at trial, or plead guilty to the charges. Oftentimes, people will enter into a plea agreement with the government. Sometimes that's referred to as plea bargaining. Or a person can just go before the judge and say that they are willing to plead guilty to the charges. In this case, this morning, on Thursday morning, Mr. Biden's attorney indicated to the judge that Mr. Biden would be willing to and wishes to enter a somewhat unusual plea where he admits that the government would have enough information, enough evidence to prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, but would not necessarily but would maintain his innocence. It's called an Alford plea, and it's very unusual in federal court. So we'll see if that goes through. It's up to the judge as to whether or not the judge will be willing to accept that offer.
Well, from your understanding, is there a precedent for this? Of what are the chances that the judge will accept this unusual plea deal?
Well, this is an unusual case with an unusual person I'm not saying that Mr. Biden's unusual. It's that being the
very high
president's
profile.
son, yes, it's an unusual position to be in, to have someone in the judge's court who's so high profile and connected to the president of the United States. I will say that in federal court, judges are very reluctant to and unlikely to accept pleas like the one that Mr. Biden's attorney proposed this morning. It is up to the judge as to whether or not he accepts it. If the judge does not accept the plea, the parties will likely proceed with jury selection.
Oh, so there is still a chance that the trial could continue despite this change in plea.
Yes.
So
well,
if
the change of plea hasn't occurred yet.
Okay.
It was proposed to the judge on Thursday morning, and the judge adjourned or postponed the hearing for my understanding is a couple of hours for the parties to confer, and then to meet back in the judge's courtroom. I think late morning California time on Thursday morning.
Okay. And so what does this mean for the first son? I mean, say they were to accept the plea, which, as you said, a little bit unlikely, but let's just play out that scenario for a second. What would the what could the punishment be for Hunter?
Well, so in federal cases, the maximum punishments permitted by law are often quite harsh, many decades behind bars in federal prison. But the reality is that when people are sentenced, even people with prior convictions or many serious prior convictions, oftentimes, and in fact almost always, the actual resulting sentence, which is up to the sentencing judge, is far, far lower than the maximum possible sentence. So while Mr. Biden could legally be facing many decades in federal prison, the reality is that the judge likely will sentence him, if he is convicted either after trial or through any type of guilty plea, sentence him to far, far less than any maximum possible sentence.
Do you think that there's a chance that President Biden could pardon his son or commute his sentence?
There's certainly a chance, but my understanding is that President Biden has indicated that he does not plan to do to pardon Hunter for his conviction in Delaware federal court, or any conviction in this in this federal case that's taking place right now in California. Now that's different than the legal analysis that I am usually involved with as a criminal defense attorney in Los Angeles. But obviously, I think with our former president and now our current president, pardons have been in the public dialogue quite a bit. And my understanding, at least, is that President Biden has made clear that it is not his plan, even though he would have the legal right to do so. It's not his plan to pardon his son for any conviction.
I know you're looking at this from a legal framework, but I just want to ask if you think at all that President Biden no longer being the nominee has at all impacted this trial, or if you think it would still be playing out all the same if his dad was running for a second term.
Well, I think that jurors, who are the ones who decide the outcome of a criminal trial, tend to take their jobs very seriously. And although we're all human and all have different approaches to interpreting evidence and following the law, for the most part, I believe that jurors, regardless of who the defendant is, take their job seriously and interpret the evidence carefully, pay attention to the testimony and the evidence as presented, and consider whether or not the government has proven its case beyond reasonable doubt. So in terms of the outcome of the trial, I don't think it would likely have any effect on the outcome of the trial, whether President Biden had decided to run for a second term, and now that he has withdrawn from that race, I don't think it will have any effect on how the jury, if a jury is impaneled, how the jury interprets the evidence and decides the case.
I also believe that the DOJ, it seemed like this was a bit surprising to them and they weren't aware that Hunter would change his plea. Do you think that at all affects this case?
Well, so Mr. Biden is represented by some of the best attorneys in the country, and they likely had their own reasons for presenting this proposed disposition without consulting the government. In my experience, oftentimes, in fact, almost all the time, defense counsel is in touch with the government prosecutors about potential guilty pleas, whether that's part of a plea agreement with the government or whether the defendant chooses to plead guilty without entering into an agreement with the government. So it is unusual for a defendant to announce basically on the eve of trial that he or she wishes to plead guilty without having run that by the government. Now, of course, Mr. Biden's attorneys did not have to alert the government that he intended to enter an Alford plea, but in my experience, generally, there is that communication with the government, and I am somewhat surprised that the government indicated they had not heard of this until the parties were in court this morning.
Right. Is there any involvement required from Attorney General Merrick Garland? Does he have to approve the deal, or what would his role be in this process?
I don't have any specific knowledge of the internal protocols at the Department of Justice when it comes to whether or not the Attorney General himself has to approve a deal. I would imagine, and I'm speculating here, that considering the high-profile nature of this case, that there are some additional steps that the Department of Justice might go through. But at the same time, my understanding is that Attorney General Garland does take pains to remove himself from any actions that might be considered political, which is why I believe that there was a special prosecutor appointed in this case in the first place. So I'm not exactly sure how involved Attorney General Garland would be, but I can be fairly certain that whatever steps he does or does not take, he's doing it deliberately to make sure that there is no appearance of impropriety or political pressure or political considerations at all, and I would imagine that Attorney General Garland is making sure that there are no political considerations here, and I think that is an important part of the Justice Department and of prosecutors in this country, is to make sure that every person is treated equally under the law, and at least that was the attempt, I believe, and the hope of Attorney General Garland, I would think, in appointing a special prosecutor in the first place, so that it didn't seem as if Attorney General Garland was somehow putting his finger on the scale.
I appreciate you breaking that all down for us. What should we know to watch out for next?
Well, I think the next step is to see whether or not the judge accepts Mr. Biden's proposed plea. As I said earlier, it's unusual for a plea like this to be proposed, let alone accepted by a judge in a federal criminal case. That said, this is an unusual case. So if the court does accept the proposed plea, then the case would continue into the sentencing phase. That tends to take at least 2 to 3 months, if not more, between the date that a guilty plea is entered and the date where the person is sentenced. If the judge does not accept the plea, which I think is just as likely, the parties would continue with jury selection, or at least begin jury selection. And I would imagine that a jury would likely be impaneled by early next week, and we would hear opening statements by midweek at the latest.
I appreciate your time today. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.